Oh, there's Max.
Where's our tech person?
He's somewhere over there.
Max, can you hear me?
Nice phone. Someone is quoting someone here.
Okay, we're just trying to, you hear me, but we're trying to hear you now, so. Max, can you just try to say something again?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Then put on Venezuela TV, and I don't know. I'm told to put it on.
Okay. So, I'm just going to introduce
¿Y
all of
Antera?
you and
TV?
we'll ask you to start, okay?
Okay.
Yes. TV, Venezuela.
Yeah, I don't know. No, I don't know. Maybe it's channel 8. It's like the state channel.
Just gonna have him put himself on mute.
It's definitely not on direct TV.
Super TV.
Yeah, try to get the live feed however you can.
Okay, good evening, everybody, and thank you for joining us. My name is Suzanne Adely, and I'm one of the organizers of this event, and I'm going to be the facilitator this evening. I'm one of the co-chairs of the International Committee of the National Lawyers Guild, which is the main sponsor of this forum. I don't know how much folks are familiar with the National Lawyers Guild. You might sort of notice many of their legal observers in green hats that come out to your demonstrations to monitor police conduct, etc. The International Committee of the National Lawyers Guild is part of the national membership of the National Lawyers Guild, which means that we have members throughout the United States and in Puerto Rico that have made the main mission of using both organizing, activist, and legal strategies to expose all manifestations of US imperialism in different parts of the world, and to work internally and with allies, both here in the United States and with colleagues and comrades in other parts of the world, to build strategies to confront and resist US imperialism in all its forms. So beyond just military intervention, also economic, also political. And the Americas is one part of the world in which the National Lawyers Guild and its members have been very prolific for many years. It's not necessarily the area of work that I'm most involved in, even though I have been part of anti-imperialist struggles around the wars in Central America back when I was a youth. And I did visit Venezuela in 2006. But my area of work is mainly to do with the Middle East, North Africa region, and in support of the liberation of Palestine. I identify as an Arab, And I'm a longtime New York City organizer who's been part of an organization called Al-Awda, the Palestine Right to Return Coalition, which grew out of working class Arab communities in New York in 2000. And I'm part also of the US Palestine Community Network. And many of the young lawyers, legal workers, and students who are part of the NLG, particularly in the new generation, come from communities of color or communities that have experienced colonialism and oppression on different levels. And we've become very active in the Guild. And I was just telling an old friend of mine that, I have a really deep appreciation for the work that the Guild does, because, and particularly the International Committee, because when we, as lawyers, have to come together and make definitive decisions and statements around what's happening in Venezuela, around what's happening in Syria, or what's happening in Nicaragua, then those conversations and those debates expose liberalism to us in a way that they're not easily exposed in other spaces. For instance, I'm a labor organizer. And it's hard in the day-to-day work of trying to organize unions to sort of see the way that liberalism creeps into our thinking and our way of organizing and doing things. And so I really appreciate the space that the Guild gives us. And one of the reasons why we wanted to have this forum is because many of us work in many different spaces of social justice where there's a deep, deep gap, where there's such a lack of acknowledgement of US empire, and there's such a lack of motivation to really, really try to build a nuanced understanding of what's happening around the globe in terms of US empire. I mean, we have been fighting US empire our entire lives, and we still sort of come back very often to the same point. And so, what we want to continue these conversations together and to think about, well, what is it that we need to do? What does resistance to empire really look like? And what is it that we need to do, not just as a legal community, but as labor and as communities of color? What do we need to do, first of all, to take back the anti-imperialist movement, and particularly from liberal-minded anti-war coalitions who, for instance, for years refused to ever acknowledge Palestine, in their work, which should have been, a red flag, I think, for anybody who's sort of part of those movements. And the last things I want to say before introducing the panelists is that, I think 1 year after Trump was elected, there was a gathering of organizations, including the Guild and organizations like Cooperation Jackson and Bannan USA and Arab Resource and Organizing Center and International Jewish Anti-Zionist Network, and many, many groups that came together at the Highlander Center to sort of think about these questions. And we didn't really come up with a lot of answers, but we did know that whatever anti-imperialist movement we could rebuild must center resistance to white supremacy, resistance to capitalism, resistance to fascism, resistance to Zionism, and uplift our communities, including uplifting indigenous sovereignty. And so these are discussions that are happening all the time in different places, but we need to really sort of put more effort into doing them in in new places and together, and so we can learn from each other as to how to proceed. So I want to introduce the panelists, and then I'm going to have them speak. The first speaker is going to be Max Blumenthal, who is joining us from Caracas. He's the editor of GreystoneProject.com and the co-host of the podcast Moderate Rebels. He's an award-winning journalist and the author of books including the best-selling Republican Gomorrah, Inside the Movement That Shattered the Party, Goliath, Life and Loathing in Greater Israel, and the 51-Day War, Ruin and Resistance in Gaza. He has also produced numerous print articles for an array of publications, many video reports, and several documentaries, including Genesis, Charlie, I can't pronounce French, so excuse me, and the forthcoming Killing Gaza, a film called Killing Gaza, so look out for that. And I'll just have him speak before I introduce the other panelists. Is that good with you all? Okay, cool.
Can you hear me? Good, good. Thanks for that intro and just a little clarification. My film with Dan Cohen, Killing Gaza, which is 3 years in the making and it's about the siege on Gaza. You can watch it at killinggaza.com. You can rent it for probably less than you could buy a half-cap double frap macchiato latte red eye with a splash of chai. So check it out. I am here in Caracas with my colleagues, my fellow moderate rebels, and we're here to break the media blockade on what's happening. And you know, what we're seeing here is definitely an economic crisis and a political crisis. There's no denying that. But what we're also seeing is very different from the reality that's been presented to you in Western corporate media. And the first thing that you won't see in Western corporate media, though you might have gotten a sense of it if you watched Elliott Abrams under questioning today on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, especially if you watched his interaction with Representative Ilhan Omar, who's turned out to be the real thing, is that the coup that the Trump administration attempted to engineer in Venezuela has essentially fizzled out. It didn't work. It didn't work, number one, because it's unpopular. And it's unpopular because the legacy of Chavismo is very strong. And people remember what it was like before Chavismo, and they're willing to fight to prevent that era of neoliberalism from dawning on them again. There are so many people in Venezuela who were excluded from society before 1998. And the people that we meet in the streets who are the diehard Chavistas are older because they remember that period. Another reason it failed is because the military, for some reason, I don't know, the Trump administration and Marco Rubio thought the military was going to flip. The military was going to turn. And the military is not going to switch sides to this unknown yuppie Juan Guaido. So that is a failure. The police are not going to flip. And yesterday, we went to a really big opposition rally. There were a lot of people there. And the first thing you notice after going to pro-government events is the class divide and the racial divide. It could not be clearer. I mean, they say society here is politically polarized. It's racially polarized, and it's polarized along class lines. The demonstration was held in a very affluent area outside in Caracas called Chacao. It is an opposition stronghold, and you get there and you see people are lighter skinned. Many of the women have dyed their hair blonde. They're wearing brand name clothes. I'm with my people here, mi gente. They think I'm one of them. And when I tell them I'm from the US and I'm from US media, they treat me with special privilege. And they were calling for, to put it crudely, calling for US imperialism. The stage at the event had two giant banners on each side that read, Ayuda Humanitaria, humanitarian aid. And what they're calling for is USAID, which is an arm of the State Department that has funded the Venezuelan opposition to the tune of tens of millions of dollars and funded regime change from Syria to Libya to Nicaragua to Cuba. They want them to ram through this aid convoy across the Colombian border and basically violate Venezuela's sovereignty and create a pretext for possibly a wider invasion or escalation. And every speaker on stage was calling humanitarian aid. People in the crowd were holding handmade signs that said, "We want the aid, USAID." So basically they're saying the US is our savior. We can't come into power unless Trump installs our person into power. And the culmination of the rally, of course, was the speech by Juan Guaido, someone whose entire career has been funded and supported by US soft power organizations. And Guaido gets up there and he's the most underwhelming speaker I have ever seen. I mean, he spoke barely above a whisper. There were very few applause lines. He was previously unknown before Trump appointed him president on January 22nd. And a lot of the crowd, and there's no question that these people love Guaido, a lot of the crowd early because they were so bored by him. So they don't, I mean, and it's easy to like have all the charisma of a filing cabinet if all you have to do is get to be president is to have Donald Trump appoint you and Wikipedia recognize you. So that's he's actually overexposed now too. He's starting to get into critical engagements with the media. Things are not going well for the opposition. Talking to a lot of people on the government side yesterday, they were worried that this was going to be a turning point, that the opposition was going to attempt something crazy, a game changer, that there were also going to be riots after the rally, that the US was going to send the aid through and there might be some kind of skirmish with the Venezuelan military, which could lead to a pretext for invasion. None of that happened. And today, Elliot Abrams said, you know, we're going to see what happens. It's kind of like a reality show where no one knows what's going to happen next, and Washington actually has no plan. Then you talk to people on the Chavista side, and there's no doubt that people are exhausted here economically, due largely to economic warfare against this country, which is a big prize for the US and the Western Hemisphere. But they have a strong anti-imperialist education, and they speak in a sophisticated way. And we're talking about people in working class barrios speak in a sophisticated way and understand what the stakes are, and they're willing to fight for their independence from US hegemony. And it's really inspiring to be around that and to also see the gains of this revolution when you go to the comunas. Like I went to one yesterday and just saw a music school of students performing Afro-Caribbean music and how talented they were. This is a comuna or a commune, a socialist collective where more than 3,000 families live that Chavez established. So they have a lot to fight for. They have a lot to lose, and they're willing to fight for it. And I think that's a big reason why the coup has failed internally. But the economic warfare has intensified. The US has seized billions of dollars of assets that Venezuela could use to get out of the economic crisis. And so I think what we're seeing here is a lot like what we saw in Syria, just in closing. What we saw in Syria, it was kind of like a rehearsal for World War III. And the US lost because the US was not willing to commit as much as the Syrian government and its allies were. And they basically stood up for themselves and threw the US and its Gulf allies out. And now people are negotiating with Damascus. Seeing in Venezuela is very similar. We're seeing the world divide up between the kind of Western imperial nations, at least whose governments support empire, the right-wing governments that are US vassal states that center around the Lima group in South and Central America, and the rest of the world. And Venezuela is going to have to choose the rest of the world. And so it's kind of a face-off. And if the US loses this round in the Western Hemisphere, then I think we're seeing another stage of the decline of US empire. And how Venezuela manages to innovate and get out of this situation will be really interesting to watch. What kind of alliances it makes. This is how the future will develop along geopolitical lines. And that's why Venezuela is so significant for every other nation that wants to resist Western hegemony.
Max, can you stay on
Thank you.
to hear the other panelists, or would you rather take some questions?
I have to record a podcast, but if you want, I can try to jump back in if there's a Q&A.
Yeah, okay. I think that in about 45 minutes, we'll begin Q&A.
If you want to just text me, I can see if I can jump back in.
Okay, is that okay with everybody? Okay, sounds good. Thanks, Max. I will text you.
Thanks for having me. Thanks everyone for listening.
Thank you very much. Okay, so our next presenter is Father Luis Barrios, PhD. He is a professor of psychology, criminal justice, Latin America, and Latino studies at John Jay College of Criminal Justice, part of the City University of New York. He's also a member of PhD faculties in social personality, psychology, and social welfare at the Graduate Center of the City University of New York. Dr. Barrios has written and co-edited more than 7 books and other numerous articles. He's a former prisoner of conscience from the School of America's Watch movement. He is also the board president of the Interreligious Foundation for Community Organization and board president of St. Anne's Corner of Harm Reduction. He is a consultant to the International Human Rights Association of American Minorities. In September 2017, he received the illustrious Lifetime Achievement Award, Community Advocacy by the Institute for Latino Studies and Research in New Jersey. At the present moment, he is also the priest in charge of Holy Rood Church, Iglesia Santa Cruz in the Washington Heights community in their Upper West Side of Manhattan. Father Barrios is a community organizer, an activist, priest, and faculty person who is in his sociotheology believes that there is a heaven, and no one is going there without passing through earth. For this reason, in his organizing and activism, he states that we are here not for what we can get in this world. We are here in order to use our radical responsibility and compassion to create a better place, a new world order. Thank you. Welcome.
Good evening. Buenas noches. Well, it's good to be here. Also, good to be at this table. Suzanne and Ximena and Natasha. I don't know if you know that Ximena's birthday is today.
Oh, no.
Está cumpliendo año. Cumpleaños.
Thank you.
But also Natasha's birthday is tomorrow. Mine was in January, the day before the Three Kings, okay? So, but I still celebrate it. Let me start by making it clear that I want peace for Venezuela. I do not want any kind of political, economic, or military violence. I want a sincere dialogue between all the parties, but without any foreign intermission. In other words, I want to make it clear that the Venezuelan people must find the solution to the problem. It's not the U.S., it's the Venezuelan people. I completely reject the lines of the United States government that their concern is based on human rights, democracy, and national security. They always come up with these three legs as an excuse to do all the atrocities that they've been doing all over the place. Here, the only motivation is imperialism and colonialism that can produce a regime change inside Venezuela. I also very strongly reject the so-called humanitarian crisis along with the so-called calling the President Maduro a legitimate president. These are two things that the media constantly is using. I recognize that there is political and economic crisis in Venezuela. Different sources can explain this reality, but there is no humanitarian crisis the way the U.S. is trying to present in all these yellow media that is all over the places here, and it gets worse when you turn on into Spanish-speaking TV, radios, and newspaper, that all of them are controlled by the Cuban mafia and the Mexican mafia here in the U.S. They're all playing the same game. Human rights or democracy are not the issue here. Despite the fake U.S. government claim, it's clear that after Hugo Chavez was elected president of Venezuela by an overwhelming majority in 1998, and at that moment that he refused to take orders from Washington, he became a fast target of U.S. aggression. This has been the pattern. Saddam Hussein was a freedom fighter until he turned around against the U.S. Then he became a terrorist. Osama bin Laden was a freedom fighter until he turned against. Manuel Noriega was a freedom fighter until he went against and not taking orders anymore. And those who never went into playing the game from the beginning, once they say no, like Hugo Chavez and President Maduro, they are in trouble with this government. So, a U.S. supported coup attack briefly overthrew Chavez in 2002. But it was like, I like to put it in theological language, it was like the resurrection of Jesus. They killed Jesus Friday. They got rid of Chavez Friday. But Jesus came back on Sunday. Chavez came back on Sunday. They can't understand until this day, because it was the first time we did a military coup, and how the hell this man came back. Because you never underestimate people's capacity to fight back. That has always been the serious mistake that this government is putting there. The creation of an opposition. I understand that there are people against the Venezuelan government. This is a democracy. So, okay, and I'm a strong believer that we need to guarantee the rights of those who are in opposition. But let me be clear. The real opposition of the Venezuelan revolution is the USA foreign policy. Everybody else is a secondary player in all this. Can be Leopoldo, can be Juan Guaido, or any other that they can create. They are just secondary players. It's the USA government who need to get the regime change there in Venezuela. The creation of a humanitarian crisis, when you turn on the radio and you see all these people looking for food in the garbage and all these pharmacy without medication. Well, without ignoring the complex socioeconomic situation that Venezuelans are experiencing, they're facing a blockade by the most powerful country. So we ask the international community, which country with 30 million people living in humanitarian crisis build 2.5 million homes in 6 years, receive 10.5 million children daily in schools, applies 9 million doses of vaccine with coverage of 84%, make a distribution every month of food for 6 million houses, and continue to lead, according to the community of Latin American Caribbean states, select the least unequal countries in the region. So where is the humanitarian crisis? So this is part of what the think tank is been doing. They produce images, they create a consensus, they manipulate the information just to produce social policy and make people miserable inside Venezuela. The whole purpose of a blockade, and we have enough experience with the Cuban Revolution, who has been there for more than 55 years supporting the blockade. Doesn't matter that the United Nations has been saying that it's illegal, it's immoral, and now the blockade against Venezuela. Blockade is one of the most powerful strategies used by the empire. When there is not enough support from the inside, you need to do something from the outside to make those inside feel miserable so they can produce some kind of reaction against the government. Hello? It's not working. It's not working. It's not working. It's not working, okay? The word that answer is my question. Why they kept silent in the 80s and the 90s with all the socio-economic disaster that was happening in Venezuela? It was not until Hugo Chavez came to power that then people started looking, where the hell is Venezuela? Now we heard about a country by the name of Venezuela. Now we need to know where that country is located. Before that, people had no idea. Now they need to know because we're doing something against that. Colombia is screaming all over the places. All these Venezuelan people coming into Colombia. I think it's about 400,000. Well, the Venezuelan government gave out a report, 6 million Colombians live in Venezuela. So they want them back? No, so shut up, okay? There is no crisis here. How many Puerto Ricans came out after Maria? Nobody care about this issue. It's invisible in the media. We are all over the places in the East Coast, and we're still getting, and the government is trying, supposedly the best they can, to bring everybody back. They're still trying. But why why we don't call this a humanitarian crisis? This selective language we need to understand. Why is that in this humanitarian crisis, not one single bank in Venezuela is being closed? They're still functioning, okay? There is a very interesting document by the United Nations independent expert on the promotion of a democratic and equitable international order that say, recent travel saw how best to enhance the enjoyment of all human rights by the population of two countries, Ecuador and Venezuela. This is 2018. He noted the eradication of illiteracy, free education from primary school to university, and programs to reduce extreme poverty, provide housing to the homeless and vulnerable, phase out privileges and discrimination, and extend medical care to everyone. Why? Because these two countries, Ecuador and Venezuela, invest 70% of the national budget to social services. That's why, okay? We're far away from doing something like that. We invest close to 55% in military equipment in the national budget. What happened with that? That's a reflection of the values that we are. In the ongoing intervention, my brothers and sisters, you know, this is being forever. This is, intervention in Venezuela is nothing new. When you look at what happened in all over the places in the world, and especially in Latin America, from the US. The Monroe Doctrine in the 19th century project this. The so-called doctrine of the big stick, you behave or I punish you. The so-called good neighbor policy, the so-called dollar policy, all this strategy orchestrated in the USA Congress to see the way they can expand imperialism and colonize countries. Jacobo Alves in Venezuela, in Guatemala, 1954. Patrice Lumumba in Congo, 1960. Goulart in Brazil, 1964. Juan Bosch, 1963, in the Dominican Republic. Salvador Allende in Chile, 1973. More recently, in the 21st century, the USA government openly supported the coup against President Chavez in 2002, Jean-Bertrand Aristide, 2004, José Manuel Zelaya in Honduras, 2009. And of course, the exceptional cases, in my opinion, Cuba being blockaded for more than 55 years, and my country, Puerto Rico, that after 1898, a military invasion, they still colonizing us in that reality against the international opinion. Well, I hope that you understand that this is a little bigger than just US imperialism. The strategy of global corporate imperialism and capitalism is implemented all over the places. I don't want to close without building some strategy, because I would like to get out of here with some idea what the hell we're going to do. But we just not going to sit down here just listening. We, in my understanding, we need to find ways to connect with others. This is a very nice space that brings us together with different agenda, okay? But all these agendas are connected. Just because Palestine is there, far away, is not dissociated from Puerto Rico. The same reality, the same empires. So where is that connection? Second, what about if we put our opinions out there? Break silent. Break silent. When we were in the campaign to get the USA Navy out of Vieques, Puerto Rico, this was part of the campaign. If I'm talking to you more than 3 minutes, believe me, it's time to talk about Vieques. So if I'm talking to you, I don't give a shit if it's in the bank line, and we having a conversation for more than 3 minutes, I'm going to talk to you about Venezuela. What is going on in Venezuela? I need to break the silence. Engage at the level that you can. From a prophetic ministry, which is what I practice, some people are very good identifying problems. That's what you know how to do, so then do that. Some people are good moving beyond that. They identify, but they break the silence. They start denouncing. So then do that. I don't care, can be singing, can be graffiti, can be writing. Do something. If you believe that standing outside there naked is going to move the agenda, so then do it. And don't stop thinking what the hell someone's going to say. Use your creativity. And my particular concern, I'm a priest. I organize in the church. I believe that organizing people's spirituality is very important. There is church and there is church. There is religion and there is religion. Yes, I recognize that religion can be an opium, but religion can be also a liberation experience. And I come from that particular experience. Behind all this imperialism is always the church blessing and domesticating people, telling them this is how God wants things to happen. My responsibility is to deconstruct that bullshit theology with all my effort. I'm going to pray, but God is not going to bring solution. I'm going to do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Abuna. That's how you say father in Arabic. He was actually just reminding me when he was talking about, recalling on 3 different occasions when me and my comrades and allies marched in the Puerto Rican Day Parade in New York with banners that said, U.S. bombs tested in Vieques dropped on Palestine. So we do have a history of coming together with different agendas, but like fighting the same, both government and corporate empires. So our next speaker is Ximena Bustamante. She's a Latin American feminist organizer and political theorist, and a member of the Democratic Socialists of America, and has been active in the International Women's Strike New York City since its beginnings in 2017. She's also part of the steering committee of Fearless Cities North America, which is an internationalist, municipalist, a summit of international municipalities who come together to think about these very same questions in cities around the world. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Well, I'm sorry that I'm not going to be as funny and entertaining as Padre Barrios, but I will, try. What I want to do today is to focus a little bit in some of the organizing work that I have been involved with recently. As Suzanne was saying, I am a member of the Democratic Socialists of America, the DSA, and other groups such as the Women's Labor Network. And these 2 groups, together with several other socialist organizations and immigrant rights organizations, have been mobilizing around the caravan, right? We have been doing a lot of caravan support work, specifically sending volunteers to Tijuana, and also just mobilizing in the city to call attention to what is happening over there. I should say that I am not an expert in Honduras politics, right? And when I speak about the caravan, necessarily we have to refer to what is happening in Honduras, what is happening in Central America more broadly. And although I am not an expert in that region's politics, I am certainly, that has been part of my history. And what I want to argue today is that we are seeing a renewed impetus, like imperialist impetus, falling upon Latin America. Certainly, as the previous speakers have pointed out, imperialist politics have never ended towards Latin America. However, I believe that there have been moments in which they have been heightened, and certainly the 1980s and the state terror that the U.S. sponsored, together with local elites in Central America, was one of those big moments. I believe that we cannot understand the crisis today in Honduras, in Guatemala, in Nicaragua, and El Salvador without going back to that previous imperialist onslaught. And I believe that now we are seeing a new moment of sort of like imperialist force. And Max was saying that U.S. empire is declining, and probably that's right. But I guess that the question that I want to pose to the public today is, what happens when the empire is declining, right? Like it becomes like really virulent. And I believe that that's part of what we are seeing today. So yeah, basically, me and my family, we are from Guatemala, and we are basically survivors of the counterinsurgent politics that were deployed throughout the region. And serendipitously, I ended up here. And it seems to me that for all of us that kind of like survived that previous kind of like imperialist wave, there's a responsibility on our side, and especially for those of us that are here in the middle of the empire, to really discuss how can we fight imperialism? How does it look like? Because it seems that even though the two major manifestations, economic and governance, are still there, the form of these two have switched, from the 80s until today. So one question for me is, how does, imperialism is looking like today? And the second is, how is it that we are going to confront it? And for me, that's not a question that pertains to experts, right? That's a question that pertains to everyone and to people that are organizing, and that can only be solved through organizing practice. So that's why today I want to just share with you a few anecdotes of what has been happening concerning the work around the caravan, just to highlight how is it that we can understand the battle around immigration as, first of all, a working class struggle, and also as a struggle around the geography of global capitalism, right? As I was saying, I believe that there is that the crisis of accumulation that the U.S. has been experiencing, and that had its clear manifestation in the crisis of 2008, has led the U.S. to take a series of measures to secure oil and gas resources, right? And that what we are seeing in Latin America, what I'm characterizing as a renewed imperialist impetus, have to do with the need to secure those kind of resources, and also with the need to compete with China and to secure places where labor is really cheap, and to build these maquila cities. And I believe that Honduras is an example of that too. It seems that because of geopolitical reasons, it's especially important for the U.S. to make sure, particularly at this moment, that its political and economic interests in the continent are secured. Right? Again, the recent history of Honduras is really complicated, and the only things that I want to refer to are the coup of 2009, and to point out how is it that in that year, when we were seeing the pink tide across, particularly South America, this government that was not a radical government, not a left government, got to power in Honduras, and Manuel Zelaya, who, people here in the public that are from Honduras can sort of like speak to that, was really a man of the elite, right? Like, and he was part of the two conservative parties that have ruled Honduras for decades. However, I guess that under this regional influence, he began, moving slightly to the left. He took some progressive positions. He made Honduras join Petrocaribe and ALBA, and that was seen by local elites as a threat, right? Like, and a coup was staged against him. Again, I cannot go into the details of the coup, but what we can see is what happened after the coup and what happened with Honduras. There are like many books that can explain this in detail. The Lone Honduran Night of Dana Frank, I believe that does a very good work explaining what happened. But the way in which she characterizes what happened after the coup is basically that Honduras, all rule of law was lost. Basically, gangs and let's say paramilitary forces sort of like were suddenly in control of the streets of Honduras. The murder rate in Honduras became the first one in the world. There was this wave of unemployment. So all these conditions and really created the source of why thousands of people have been fleeing Honduras, right? And such as those of us that came from Guatemala and El Salvador fled in the 80s. Honduras, people from Honduras began fleeing massively in these last 10 years. So regarding the caravans and the particular form of organizing the fleeing that the caravans entailed, there's a long history of caravans as a force of life and as a force of resistance. I just want to make reference to a couple of recent sort of like manifestations of the caravan as a political force. In Mexico, as probably you have heard, and this is one of the reasons why the people fleeing from Honduras have organizing caravans, is that the trip north has become incredibly dangerous, right? Like the country is militarized. There are all these human trafficking rings operating along the routes of migration. So people have been pushed to taking more dangerous paths. And in the last, let's say, 10 years, some numbers say that 70,000 people have disappeared on their way north in Mexico, right? So literally, Mexico is a country of mass graves, and that's how people are referring to it right now, right? Mass graves of Mexicans and mass graves of people migrating through Mexico. So a couple of manifestations of the caravan that seem to me like a precedent of the Honduran caravans are, on the one hand, the caravan of mothers of disappeared migrants in Mexico. So in Mexico, there have been already several trips of mothers of disappeared people that have just toured the country looking for the bodies of their relatives. And there's also a caravan of Central American mothers searching for the disappeared. And indeed, the second caravan took part in a summit, and in the first international summit of mothers of disappeared people around the world that met in Mexico City in October. So when this caravan, like the caravan of the mothers of Central American disappeared migrants, got to Mexico City for the international summit, the caravan from Honduras, the migrant caravan or refugee caravan, was getting to Mexico City too. So even though we cannot really right now trace the connections between those different caravans, I just want to highlight how is it that the caravan in recent years has really constituted a force of resistance. So just focusing on the caravans coming from Honduras that have been called refugee caravans or Central American Exodus. The one that we saw on 2018, around October, is not the first one, as probably you know. In 2017, there were two smaller ones, a few hundreds of people. And in 2018, it's when the caravan as a strategy of collective migration came to mainstream media, especially in the US, when around 7,000 people, those are the calculations, got together to travel north. And right now, there's another caravan making its way north from Honduras, El Salvador, and Guatemala. So I believe that a very important thing regarding the caravans is how we see that they are a sort of like a strategy of self-organizing, right? One thing that media has been saying around the caravans is trying to find like a mastermind behind them, right? Like not really highlighting what are the consequences, like the geopolitical history that created these caravans and that has made push people out and has pushed people to create these mechanisms to keep themselves safe while traveling north. So some people were saying it's Trump that really orchestrated the caravans to sort of like influence the midterms. Others said it's Soros. I don't know, all kind of like these paranoias, right? And what seems to me the crucial thing here is that it's none of those, right? Like it's actually the people that are like confronting these conditions, self-organizing, tapping into each other's networks, and just like deciding to work together. And certainly there have been like many organizations working with them north, right? And those organizations, like for example, Pueblos Sin Fronteras, have been incredibly criminalized. So just a week ago, for example, one of the organizers of Pueblos Sin Fronteras was disappeared in the south of Mexico. Until today, there are no news of him. And this kind of sort of like news don't really sort of like circulate, right? Like, regarding some of the characteristics of the caravans, people have been speaking a lot about the decision-making processes, right? Which I believe that are fundamental. Not only, you know, how people came together, but also how people kept themselves alive and together throughout the country. Because the Mexican government deployed all kind of like counterinsurgency tactics against the caravan. And you know, like it was like following the caravan, trying to break it apart, to break it in smaller groups, picking up people that lagged behind, since they could not like directly just crack down on it. So a lot of like the force of the caravan has been its own internal processes of organizing and of trying to keep like different interests and infiltrators at bay by creating assemblies. So what has happened, let's say, on this side, right, like of the equation? Many of us, you know, like in different organizations have been trying to mobilize to support the caravan, as I said, like sending volunteers and also mobilizing here in New York. And we have faced like a series of challenges. And I want to just tell you briefly what are some of the questions that we have been dealing with, because for me, those are the ones that we have to address to figure out how to actually understand immigrant justice as a fight against imperialism. So for instance, many of the groups that have been mobilizing here are socialist groups, and there are like some immigrant-based organizations, not that many. And what we found is that when some of us some of us that have been very close to immigrant rights organizations and that are also part of leftist groups will approach the immigrant organizations, some of which are the most militant ones, we will find different types of responses of whether they should engage or not with the struggle around the caravan. There were some that said, and very fairly, we are at capacity because, you know, like what we are facing here is so a big challenge here, meaning inside of the US, that we cannot deal with that, right? Like, and that's pretty understandable. But there were other answers too, like that's a distraction, right? That's not really the struggle that we should be engaging with, because we are fighting to keep people here, right? Like, although of course I understand, you know, like where these comments are coming from, I believe that we really need to problematize them and sort of like ask, what do they do? You know, like, and it seems to me that this kind of narrative reproduces the inside and the outside, right? There's an argument that we are like so drowned here, you know, like ICE is picking up people all over the place, right? Like there are raids. We cannot really think about what's going on down there, right? But what some of us have been trying to say is that, I mean, we have to, right? Like these two stories are kind of like combined. And what we have also been seeing is that the people that have been mostly organizing around the caravan are organizations in the border, right? Most of immigrant-based organizations in the rest of the country have been very little involved. And the organizations in the border are facing a double sort of like challenge. On the one hand, they are just trying to keep people alive, right? Like because of the conditions of people coming in the caravan are just horrendous. The Mexican government, until very late in the game, provided basic sort of like support, but for the most part, people were just like living in stadiums, sleeping on like the floor, without bathrooms, persecuted by the military outside of the stadiums where they were staying. I mean, it's really this management of population, like these operations. And so the organizations now there were indeed actually in the coalition that was created in Tijuana and San Diego, they had two wings. The wing trying to keep people alive, just fighting for survival, and the wing that was trying to develop a political framework to address what was happening. And I believe that division that happened in the coalition in Tijuana and San Diego, I mean, it's not a split, it's just like a sort of like a strategic division that they created, just tells us, like some of the challenges. How is it that, like those organizations can at the same, on the one hand, just try to sort of like provide basic services while also trying to develop a political framework of how to act around the caravan. Because how to act around the caravan is not just about, like trying to get that people in, but it necessarily sort of like requires addressing the questions of sort of like immigration enforcement within the US and these questions of imperialism, like how is it that Mexico has become a vertical border and that's part of a regional strategy, and what the US has done of Honduras, right? Like all that has to be part of a single kind of like political framework. And such as they in the border have been fighting on how to do that, those of us inside the US have also been sort of like struggling on how to articulate all those pieces. I believe that one of the things that we could sort of like explore has to do with who in Honduras, for example, is like profiting, like from the coup, sort of like identifying. We know that there are like all these multiple corporations that are engaging in extractivist policies, right? Like, and that have thrived after the coup. Identifying those, identifying which public institutions in the US are involved in supporting the coup. Not only who in DC should be lobbied, like against, around Honduras, but also all the complicity of multiplicity of public offices, right, on the coup and on perpetuating certain economic interests in Honduras. So I guess that's, I don't know if this is too much. I hope that it was not too confusing, but that's one of the paths that some of us mobilizing here have been following, like trying to address how we can, at the same time that we pay attention to what is happening within the US, take into account border politics and find ways of fighting sort of like imperialism through putting pressure in entities here within the United States. So I guess that I'm going to end there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ximena. That was great. Our next speaker is Natasha Bannan. She's a former president and first Latina president of the National Lawyers Guild. Natasha's work focuses on the economic exploitation and discrimination against low-wage Latina and Latino immigrant workers, as well as legal support in the face of the economic and humanitarian crisis in Puerto Rico. She works on both domestic litigation and international advocacy before human rights mechanisms concerning issues including state-sanctioned violence and failure to protect self-determination and decolonization processes, gender justice, and immigrant rights. Natasha.
All right. I hope y'all are still with me. All right. Sitting, listening. We're gonna turn this into a conversation pretty soon, I promise. I want to thank the panelists who've gone before me, who've offered tremendous insight, and to Suzanne, our organizer and moderator, from whom I draw deep insight and inspiration from her work and analysis. I guess I want to focus my comments a little bit more broadly in terms of what I see as the shift in U.S. imperialism over the last decade or so, or a couple of decades, and hopefully leading us into our conversation about what the implications of that are for our own organizing work here, and what that means for our movements that are entrenched in U.S. exceptionalism and really lacking of an anti-imperialist framework, and how we can show up for that. So as Luis mentioned, stemming from the Monroe Doctrine onward, right, the U.S. has always signaled to the rest of the world, at that point to Europe, that Latin America was theirs, right, that this was their backyard. Lately, I think they're signaling more to China and Russia that they continue to want to assert their presence, and are doing that through various means. When we think of the Trump State Department, which is really the Rubio State Department for purposes of Latin America, now Rubio, Bolton, Pompeo for Venezuela purposes, we see even the implementation of some policies that seem counter to what has historically been U.S. interest in the region. So over time, I think you've seen a shift from what was historically really a military presence and military alliances that were centered on land possessions, land being the source of many conflicts internationally, to increasingly economic alliances that are supported by military action. That it isn't just land grabs, it's really about the use of the land, and particularly the resources on those lands. So whether it's oil and oil economy, coca for the drug trade that the U.S. funds under the misnamed war on drugs, natural resources, gold, emeralds, et cetera. U.S. foreign policy has been based on a model of extractive economies where we are taking out, resources, people, labor, and exploitation. And that hasn't changed. Just how that's happening, I think, has shifted a little bit. And it's centered on a protectionism that's really very present in the Trump White House. The American protectionist principles of having to protect our interests. Increasingly, those interests are really the corporate state that we see. It isn't just U.S. interests in terms of U.S. people, whatever that has been historically. It's really now U.S. corporate actors whose interests are being protected. And how do we see that? Well, we see that in, for example, the NAFTA and CAFTA tribunals, where U.S. multinational businesses are asserting interest under a treaty that the United States government has signed because sovereign governments refuse to allow them to drill, to mine, to exploit their land and their resources. And corporate actors are asserting interest under these treaties on behalf of sovereign governments, on behalf of the U.S. and on behalf of Canada. In a twist on what I think what the intent of those tribunals have been for, right? Recently, as of last week, the very honest statement by John Bolton that, the reason why the U.S. is so concerned about Venezuela is because it presents a great opportunity for U.S. oil companies. It is a very clear, honest statement as to what we see our future interests have been. And U.S. business has been in Venezuela since Chavez, right? They decided we're going to stick this out because there will be regime change eventually. And when there is, we will be the first ones to be able to be in here to tap into the oil economy. We see the corporate actor being the priority of U.S. intervention in Puerto Rico, where we have the imposition of a junta, a federal fiscal control board, composed of 7 financial executives that have been given the authority, the power to veto a democratically elected government, and who have explicitly said that they are prioritizing payment to creditors, hedge funds, and investors, making sure Puerto Rico has supposed access to the markets, and that their vision is to turn Puerto Rico into a Singapore or Hong Kong of the Caribbean, which we know is essentially an elite playground for the ultra wealthy. the reestablishment or establishment of diplomatic relations with Cuba, the U.S. has been very clear that it's about promoting capitalism and U.S. business interests and policies and opening up the market to U.S. business. And of course, the coup in Honduras was really always about kind of supporting the oligarchy and the wealthy elite there, right? So I think it's important to, when we're thinking about, well, what does U.S. intervention and imperialism looks like now, that it's really centered around the corporate state, which increasingly there's no distinction between the state and the corporate sector anymore through deregulation, through a number of things. In order to maintain then the U.S. presence and a reliance in the region on the U.S., there's had to be intentional efforts to disrupt regional solidarity and projects that integrate regional identity and that shifts the focus away from the U.S. as being the sole kind of economic engine, which is precisely why Venezuela has been a target in addition to its oil-rich economy, but because it's been the center of projects like ALBA, UNASUR, CELAC, Mercador that have promoted regional integrity and identity and dependence and interdependence in a way that removes the U.S. as playing a primary role in there. The U.S. has promised kind of military might for obedience. However, that's not really needed, particularly given that there are other global actors on the stage. And so what we see are increasingly military alliances with civilian law enforcement, both here and in the region. So you have the NYPD training military, right, and sharing intelligence and the expansion of the security state. We see spying, we see drones, we see shared intelligence, we see TSA, US TSA officials in the airport of Mexico City, sharing databases. We see not only military alliances, but civilian law enforcement alliances with military actors, which is troubling. And so along kind of the different ways that intervention looks, military and kind of the security state, which is becoming an all-expansive security state, is that the U.S. uses national security to justify policies of intervention, but also anti-immigrant policies to keep people away from our border, but to keep them within their own borders only, and to discourage immigration. We see that, for example, with Plan Frontera Sur, where the U.S. has exported our immigration policy to Mexico and has moved our southern border to Mexico's southern border. And so we finance the Mexican military and immigration officials to enforce U.S. immigration policy so that they don't even make it to the U.S. border, right? And we do that by training them, right? The increase in military bases all throughout Latin America, obviously the 7 that exist in Colombia continue to exist, but there's been an expansion, Honduras, Puerto Rico, Cuba, etc. The shared intelligence increasingly with fascist allies and alt-right governments, when we think about Brazil and Argentina and Colombia, and the rise of their versions of fascist governments or nationalistic governments, and the framing, the false concern of human rights, democracy, rule of law, due process, to intervene, but we never see kind of focus on strengthening like judicial processes or investigations or prosecutions. It's always around the military. The economic intervention that we see in Venezuela is part of the Kissinger playbook, make the economy scream. That's unilateral sanctions, which have under international law been declared to be illegal, are rejected by the majority of countries in the world. Unilateral sanctions, withholding of goods in order to create tremendous demand that can then be put on the local governments as being incapable, inept, having no political will to be able to meet the needs of the people, when really, in fact, it's the U.S. trying to control the markets and withhold critical supplies with drawing trade, cutting off credits, closing banks, et cetera, that it's all intended to create an economic structure that has the appearance of being a failed government or a failed economic model, an economic model that's traditionally been based on either progressive economic policies or socialism, right, or redistribution of wealth, to show that that economic model is not sustainable, and to promote internal rebellion against the government, when in fact it's by design to economically, instead of directly intervening economically, to create the conditions where you have kind of a failed economy. I want to, maybe that'll be more in the Q&A. I want to talk about kind of how this affects our work here and what does it mean for our work here, but maybe we can do that in a discussion amongst the panelists. All right.
Yeah, so we can start with maybe taking some questions or comments from the audience, and then seeing what discussion that takes us into.
And what happened with Max? Not
I texted him, he'll come back, hopefully. Mhm. Go ahead. Couple more? Yeah. Expressway, FMLNistas are coming, Hondurans are coming, people from Argentina are coming, Long Islanders who are concerned about Venezuela are coming. So it may, be a trend that people are really getting fed up with this. I know this is probably wrong, but I want to say something about. Can't hear you. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, yeah. Necessary that people do this in their libraries and their Max is back. Max, can you hear us? One second. Just to go after what the announcement that you were making about Long Island Action on February 23rd, I think there's also going to be one at Wall Street on February 23rd at 1 p.m. And then I also saw earlier today that there was also going to be an action in New Jersey at the offices of Cory Booker. I believe it's also the same day. You can look for it on Facebook. So it looks like that's kind of shaping to be a day in which different communities are going to express their opposition to this current foreign policy agenda. I'm just going to, I wonder if you want to just kind of start with a couple of these questions about the economics while I get Max back on, and then we can take some more questions.
I'll just briefly answer your question without being an economist. I mean, I think if you would talk to folks in Venezuela, they would tell you it's never a solid idea to base your economy on one product, especially when it's a fossil fuel and when it's part of an extractive economy and non-renewable resource that we're trying to move away from. And that the result of that has actually been that Venezuela doesn't produce much, right? People have become, I mean, this is actually what we were told, people have become reliant on the fact that they can have a subsidized economy based on this one resource, and it hasn't required them to produce anything that they could export or to diversify their economy. So just from an economic model, it's not sustainable, but it also creates kind of an undue reliance on one resource that we want to move away from as a whole, and is actually in many ways in conflict with other goals of other struggles, in addition to kind of undermining their own economic independence, really, precisely because even before this, we saw when the barrel prices of oil dropped, well, all of the programs that were subsidized and the economy began to also drop. So it's, I think that if Chavez were around and could do it a little bit differently, perhaps other choices would have been made.
Anybody else?
Let me say something about, because it's a little complicated, because having a country with one particular product, I don't see any problem with that if we had this humanitarian relationship between countries. Eugenio María de Hostos saw this in the 19th century, and Ramón Emeterio Betance through the Federación Antillana to find a solution to these islands. So one island can produce something, and we can go into exchange. So I think the big problem here is, like for example, in the case of Venezuela, so you had the USA international foreign policy that calls Saudi Arabia and the whole control of the OPEC, and they say we're going to sabotage the Venezuelan oil and petroleum. That is a big issue, okay? So yes, so that's why I'm saying it's a little more complicated, because it's not just about producing one product. Yes, it's good if they can produce something else. I see also how the U.S. is been trying, like for example, you remember when in the 1990s it was clear the Cuban Revolution, this so-called dependency on the Soviet Union, it was around 94%. So they collapse, Cuba is going to collapse. So they came back. That's why every single expert in the U.S. gave the Cuban Revolution 6 months. But they found a way, as a people's revolution, to do the reconstruction of the social economy, and they started producing the alternative. What the USA foreign policy is trying to do is that Venezuela they've been blocking all the possible solution. Of course, no, I'm not saying that Venezuela is Cuba. It's a big difference with the resources, especially the human resources, to fight back. But they get in there. But again, putting everything in the basket, that is because 94% is in oil and petroleum revenue. That is why the crisis, no, it's more complicated. Is that? Yes, but it's also the blockade. It's also this sabotage coming from all over the places. And going into this so-called Dutch whatever, I go back to the issue of when we were talking about Jacobo Arbenz in 1954. Okay, so there's a formula that when I'm teaching Latin American studies, I like to follow. There's no way you're going to establish a progressive government in Latin America without going against USA foreign policy. Doesn't matter, you can be right-wing. That's why some people say, well, Zelaya was not a socialist. Zelaya was, well, okay, that's not the point. It's that you started hanging around with the wrong people, and you piss up some people here in Washington, and now they're going to go against you. So that's part of that also reality. So then those people in the fruit company call his brother, who was the CIA director, they say, I have problems here in Guatemala with this guy, and they overthrow the government. And it's always been like that, okay? You try to produce some kind of progressive. Look at Juan Bosch in the Dominican Republic. He went against the oligarchy. He went against the Roman Catholic Church. He went against the U.S. foreign policy. 7 months in power, and they overthrow him, okay? Siete Mesino. So, yes, this is a reality that we always need to take. It's complex, which means we need to produce complex solutions.
Thank you. Yeah, I just want to say something. I don't know if I got your question about labor, but I just want to touch upon that. I guess that as I was trying to argue, I believe that we should. What I was suggesting is what I was proposing is like addressing immigration as a labor issue and addressing immigration as a labor issue as a sort of like fight against imperialism. And to do that, on the one hand, we have to to pay attention to what Natasha was saying, how the economic manifestations of imperialism have to do certainly with uneven trade agreements, with the structural adjustments and dependency of the perpetuation of dependency via debt, but also with extractive industries and with certain particular regimes of labor, right, that are being sort of like imposed over Latin America. And that's why I try to touch upon how both in Honduras and in other countries of Central America, there have been this push for creating export processing zones, right, that will allow the U.S. to have places to manufacture very cheaply, right, that will allow them to sort of like their products to compete with the cheap sort of like workforce that prevails in China's sort of like manufacturing sort of like companies. And also regarding labor, I believe that we should keep in mind that the battle around immigration is a battle to govern labor, right? Like, and not to impede immigrant labor to come in, because like this country needs immigrant labor to operate, but to regulate who comes in, when, and how, right? Like, and to keep that labor under control. And I believe that that's why we should really expand our notion of what the wall is. It seems to me that the wall is not only something that is going to be built, I mean, that kind of exists and wants to, like, probably is going to be expanded in the border, but the wall is all this regional strategy of, as Natasha was saying, militarizing, like extending the southern border towards Mexico, right? Like militarizing all that area, militarizing the border between Mexico and the U.S., but also how immigration enforcement is working inside the U.S., right? That's also the wall at every corner. When like you are an immigrant worker that is sort of like contributing to this country and keeping this economy going. And at the same time, you are terrified that, like at every corner you can have like an encounter and be thrown into immigration detention, as has happened recently with, for example, Eduardo, like this compañero from a worker center in upstate New York. So that's also, right, like the wall. And the wall is also how immigrant labor even in New York, the conditions are of quasi-slavery. Like how you have people that have like shifts of 12 hours, 1 day off, and that certainly cannot mobilize, not to protect, like their most immediate community, definitely not to protect the people in the caravan, right? Like all that is sort of like how we should understand the wall and why we should understand it as a labor struggle, I guess.
Thank you, Ximena. Okay, we're going to take some more questions, and I think that if you want Max to hear you, that you probably will have to use this, so I'm going to offer it to the next question.
Thanks. I appreciate all the panelists. My question is to Max, however, on this issue. I have so appreciated, Max, your reporting on Nicaragua and what's going on there. And I think it's important to bring Nicaragua into this discussion here because John Bolton certainly has with the troika of tyranny. And so I was wondering if you could just comment on the imperialist drive underway in Nicaragua that began in earnest last April.
Well, thanks for the question. I'm really glad you brought up Nicaragua. I was there in July of 2018, basically at the tail end of what was a US-backed coup attempt. It wasn't as overt as what we're seeing with Venezuela, and I think the US had good reason to kind of conceal its hand because what took place in Nicaragua was along the lines of a color revolution where it appears to be a popular uprising, and you demonize the leadership for human rights violations and for basically crushing the will of the people, when in fact most Nicaraguans were not on board with what developed into a very violent destabilizing campaign for regime change. Now, the attempt at regime change did not begin in earnest on April 18th, which is when the soft coup began. It began really immediately upon Daniel Ortega's inauguration in 2007. And this was also an important year in Venezuela because that's when the cadre of students that centers around Juan Guaido started their training through US soft power networks. I published an article called The Making of Juan Guaido with Dan Cohen at thegrayzoneproject.com, where we explain how these US soft power networks, the National Endowment for Democracy and USAID, trained Juan Guaido, Leopoldo Lopez, John Goycochea, a lot of these right-wing student figures to carry out destabilizing activities, which became the Guarimbas in 2014. And basically the Guarimbas became the basis for the model that was used by the mostly right-wing Nicaraguan opposition in 2018, where in opposition-heavy areas, blockades were established, barriers were established, and then they were used kind of as trenches for fighting the local security forces. In Nicaragua, they were called tranques. And at the tranques, which were basically roadblocks set up, often by criminal gangs, there were many rapes, there were many killings, motorists who were extorted. In one case, an unarmed community police officer who worked with at-risk youth named Gabriel Vado was dragged to death by a truck and then had his corpse burned on camera at a tranque. In another case, Sander Bonilla, who is a young Sandinista activist that I interviewed, was captured at a tranque and taken to an unknown location where he was tortured. He had plastic bags dripped on him while priests presided over the torture because the Roman Catholic Church was heavily involved in the coup in Nicaragua. But the point that I want to make is that the groups that oversaw the coup attempt in Nicaragua were trained and funded by the same US soft power groups that have been behind Juan Guaido and the Popular Will Party that he comes from in Venezuela, the National Endowment for Democracy and USAID. And a lot of that funding really started coming through in 2007 towards the end of the Bush administration. And there's another interesting component about Nicaragua that you should be aware of. I don't know, those of you who've been in the debates about Nicaragua, who stood up against regime change, would be familiar with the fact that there is an element in the left that really was on board with regime change. And they're connected to and often have friendships and relationships with a party in Nicaragua called the MRS, or the Movement for the Renovation of Sandinismo. And I revealed in an investigation I did for Mint Press that this party had been funded by the US through those same soft power organizations to fragment the Sandinista movement from within the left inside Nicaragua. And a lot of the kind of wealthier Sandinistas, they call them scandalistas, because they're always looking for different scandals to promote within the Sandinista movement, were funded through this group. Gioconda Belli, who is an extremely affluent poet and writer, is a prominent MRS figure. Monica Boltadano, who's a supposed social democrat and a radical feminist, is in with this group. And they often run these NGOs, which are funded by USAID. And they've been very effective. Although they can't get elected to dog catcher in Nicaragua, they have less than 1% support. They've been very effective at fragmenting and undermining solidarity for the Sandinistas in the West, because these are the Sandinistas who are wealthy, who look like me. They're lighter skinned, they speak English, and they make friends with prominent journalists, including Stephen Kinzer. He's very close to them from the Boston Globe. And so he goes off script on regime change when it comes to Nicaragua because of his wealthy MRS friends. But this is a US-backed party. The US has done, electoral get out the vote activities for them. And so we need to see how sophisticated the US has become since the end of the Cold War. It isn't the CIA coming in and doing palace coups anymore. They're doing what they call democracy promotion and all kinds of what they call nonviolent training, and it often winds up to be very undemocratic and violent when they decide to mount a coup. What makes Venezuela so special right now is that it's just all out in the open. It's just like everything with Trump. He's taken everything the US always did in secret and lifted the mask on it and just put it all out there for everyone to see. So again, it's important to recognize Nicaragua in the context of Venezuela as well as Cuba. When John Bolton says that there is a troika of tyranny, what he's saying is that Venezuela is the anchor of these socialist-oriented governments in Nicaragua. And after they take down Venezuela, they're going to move in on Cuba, declare a sponsor of terror, and then they're going to move in on Nicaragua. And not one single member of Congress voted against the NICA Act, which is a de facto economic blockade on Nicaragua. So keep Nicaragua in mind when you're opposing US policy in Latin America. Defend what's happening there, because the Sandinista movement has been very effective at on a small scale, alleviating poverty and building infrastructure and making the lives of people who've been excluded and ignored better with very little resources. And I've seen it, having been in Nicaragua before the Sandinistas came back into power and after. So it's important to keep it in mind.
Thank you, Max. So I will give the other panelists an opportunity to also respond to the question on Nicaragua, but what I want to do is maybe take 3 to 4 more questions and comments, and then have all the panelists, including Max, address them. And if your question is addressed to one person, then let us know. If it's for the whole group, let us know. And you can use the mic so Max can hear you.
This is a question to Max and also to the panel. And Max is a signer on the No War on Venezuela statement. But it has to do with February 23rd and what seems to be an announcement by Juan Guaido of the humanitarian, quote, caravan beginning on that day. It's a 1-month anniversary of the U.S. attempted coup. So if you're able to say a little bit more about that, if that is seeming to be heard or announced there, and also other things to do in Venezuela with the 1-month anniversary. And just while I have the mic, because I won't have it again, I'll say one other word about February 23rd, which is, of course, a demonstration here in New York at Wall Street, but it is really a global day. And just in the New York area, along with Long Island, several cities in Connecticut, 5 in New Jersey, there will be a whole series of actions around the world on that day. And it's been very exciting to see that this statement, which is totally in solidarity with Venezuela and denouncing the sanctions and the U.S. role as a real cause of Venezuela's problem, is translated into 15 languages and has thousands of signers online. So it's really an effort to how do we strengthen and reinforce global coordination of the movement coming together and people strongly standing with Venezuela and against all U.S. plans. But just if there's a little bit more on what's happening on the 1-month anniversary, maybe that Max knows. And thank you.
Somebody else had their hand up?
My name is Lucy Pagoada Quesada, and I'm very happy to be here today. I thank you all for the amazing presentations you all gave, and for the audience, it's so amazing. I am the official representative of the FNRP, the National Resistance Popular Front in Honduras, and the Libre Party, which is the political arm of the resistance in Honduras, coordinated by President Zelaya, who to me is, and to us in Honduras, is the first victim, right? A leader, popular leader of the people, who was brutally expelled in 2009. It is 2019 now, and this is the 10th anniversary very soon, the 10th anniversary of the coup. The coup happened in 2009, June 28, 2009. So thank you for bringing in this whole concept of US interventionism in Latin America is very important, and I agree that we need to make all of the connections. I'm just very briefly going to say that to us, the United States came back extremely violent after their wars in the Middle East, and it started with Honduras in 2009. And ever since, they haven't started either perpetrating coups, like the one in 2010 in Paraguay, which we cannot leave out with President Lugo. And then after that, the attempted coups of the progressive leaders of Latin America, because we also have to be positive about this. There is something really positive about it, and I also like to look at the positives. When the United States decided to go back to look into Latin America, it is because something very important was happening there, and it's called 21st Century Socialism, right? Led by President Hugo Chavez, woohoo! And so this is what was making the United States very angry, right? Realizing that a lot of leaders, I made the list here because I don't want to leave these leaders out. They are so important for all of us. Of course, Venezuela, President Hugo Chavez. In Argentina, there were the Kirchners. In Ecuador, there was President Correa. In Bolivia, there is President Evo Morales, still leading the Bolivian revolution. In Honduras, there was President Zelaya that, as Ximena said, he was not a revolutionary, right? But he was making very good alliances with all these leaders in Latin America. One of them was signing with ALBA, the Bolivarian Alternative for the Americas, and with Petrocaribe, which for the empire represented the first breakthrough monopoly of US companies in Honduras. And you know, once the pocket of the empire and neoliberalism is touched and capitalism, that's when the United States gets very angry. So also, what was going on in Brazil with President Lula, right? What was going on in Uruguay, and even with Paraguay, there was all these progressive leaders going on in Latin America. It was a great time from Latin America. And the United States realized that. And that's what they're trying to crush. That's what they're trying to stop. Then we also had El Salvador, right, with the FMLN government. And we have Nicaragua, and of course we have Cuba. So a lot of wonderful things were happening in the region that the United States was very unhappy with. But I'll tell you this much. I do believe that the people of Latin America are fed up. We are tired in Latin America and in here, and we are not willing to take the abuse of the United States. So people are fighting back, just like we see the amazing fight in Nicaragua, just like we see the amazing fight in Venezuela, just like you don't see the amazing fight in Honduras, but it's happening. And it's happening here too. So what I'm saying is that the people of Latin America are resisting. We're not gonna stop resisting, and that's very important. We need to stay optimistic, and we need to support the people of these countries, because we're not going down. We're not just taking the United States abuse for granted. We are fighting back, and I believe that when we stop the US, because we are gonna stop the US from intervening in Venezuela, that's gonna set such an important example to us. That's why we need to defend our revolution the same way that we need to defend the revolution in Nicaragua and the revolution in Cuba and all the processes that are going on. And we see how now they're using different strategies. For example, what happened in Brazil, when now they're using different types of coup. It's no longer military, but now it is parliamentary. And it is different types of coup that they use, and they're using different strategies. We need to be very careful about that too. But what I'm trying to say is that there is a resistance of the people, and it is very much systematic, and it is very much practically everybody. Like, we understand what's going on, and we are not taking the abuse for granted. So I don't want us to live here with a pessimistic attitude. I think that we need to look at what is happening, and we need to support the people of our region. And we need to look at what's happening in Haiti, because we cannot leave Haiti out. We also need to come up for Haiti and speak up on behalf of Haiti and the resistance in Haiti. Thank you very much.
Thank you for that brilliant and uplifting statement, and for bringing into the conversation sort of Haiti and Brazil and Salvador, and because we could have a whole series of these discussions, and I really do love that positive framework, and I think hearing you and hearing also what Ximena was talking about was that the self-organization of the caravans and their survival is resistance to U.S. imperialism, and just like just again like the survival of Palestinians after all these years, and they're continuing to resist also is an example of resistance to imperialism. And there's so many other places that we could talk about. So are there a couple of other questions before we go back to the panelists? Yes. Anyone else?
Yeah, I just wanted to ask real quick to everyone in the panel, how would you propose to respond to those folks who, and there's many of them in the United States who would like to be in solidarity with Venezuela, with Honduras, with El Salvador, but like to kind of Monday morning quarter or backseat drive what people in Venezuela really ought to be doing, or what people in Honduras really ought to be doing to fight imperialism, when our role here is to defend them, against U.S. imperialism and trust their decisions about what the best route forward is. And I just wanted to ask, everyone here, what's the best way to respond to that kind of, backseat driving? And I just wanted to add real quick, if you are interested in February 23rd, there's a meeting this Saturday at 3 p.m. to plan for all those actions. But anyway, Monday morning quarterbacking, backseat driving. How do we respond to that? Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
Hi, I want to go back to Father Barrios' reminding us about the big stick. The big stick being principally U.S. military power in service of U.S. imperialism. And so I want to suggest that one of our roles in supporting the self-determination of peoples throughout the Americas and around the world, is to start challenging the vast military power that it all comes from resources that start here, whether it's corporate taxes or personal taxes. And I'm not suggesting tax resistance as the principal approach, but Martin Luther King Jr. reminded all of us that the bombs that dropped in Vietnam, the soldiers that were sent to Vietnam, all of this supposedly in the name of national security, was going on at the same time that our communities all around our cities and our towns were being devastated, and they're still being devastated. The resources that go to the military are resources that are not coming to our neighborhoods. To this. They don't come to our neighborhoods.
No, you can hear you.
Still working? Hello?
Yep.
Oh, okay. The resources that are going to the military are not coming into our communities. And so I just want to suggest that one of the routes that we really ought to explore is challenging the power that's centered in the Pentagon, of course the State Department, but the Pentagon is the most obvious manifestation of U.S. imperial power. And I think that there are opportunities to build bridges, to those among us in our own communities, right here in New York City, for example, which, by the way, is the media capital of the United States. So if we were to get something going on that level, it would make news, I think. I mean, if we built it broadly enough, faith groups, community groups, labor groups, peace groups, we might be able to start something and change the whole conversation. So there is a small movement beginning now. Some of us call it Move the Money, New York City. And we're starting to put immediate pressure on an unlikely place, our city council, populated by a bunch of mostly Democrats who, extraordinarily uncomfortable about dealing with this, but it's a place to begin, and it's a place that our people out in the neighborhoods understand, and it's a place that we can expose if they don't respond favorably to what we're pushing for. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you.
No, but Suzanne, first, more people.
What does an economically independent Puerto Rico look like? Forget the political status. How can Puerto Rico actually be independent economically without depending on the United States?
My question is for say Latinos in the diaspora living within the empire, dentro del imperio, we resist this empire, we oppose it, but there's a lot of, how can I say, resources that we have in the empire. And I think my question is, how do we utilize the resources that we're able to gain and pull within the empire to help our people out in Latin America to be anti-imperialist? And as well as, I had one other question is also pertaining towards our youth within the empire that falls victim of poverty, of displacement, of drugs, of gangs, of how do we get that youth who are in gangs, gang members, involved in this type of work of decolonizing them and making them more anti-imperialist.
Thank you. That's a great question. Okay, so we're going to now then ask our panelists to address whichever ones of these questions that they'd like to. Some were addressed directly to them. And maybe spend about 3 or 4 minutes each sort of answering the questions and wrapping up. I mean, unless you guys want to stay much, much longer. But I would also then add to your considerations by, Max earlier mentioned Ilhan Omar, the Somalian congresswoman. I mostly think that a lot of this kind of like progressive electoral politics is a bit of a distraction from our work. But Ilhan has really been showing a brave face in confronting the empire in her calling out of the AIPAC Israeli lobby yesterday. And despite the amount of like enormous attacks against her, then today grilled Elliot Abrams, in his role in the Central American wars during the Reagan administration. And I think about Ilhan and her own story, and she's from Somalia, right? And somebody mentioned how what Trump is exposing a lot of what often stays secret. And just as you mentioned that we can't forget Haiti, we can't forget Africa. And we can't forget US command in Africa and what it's currently doing in Somalia that we don't hear about. And just like that there's a migrant crisis on our border, there's a migrant crisis at the Mediterranean Sea that's driven from this sort of militarized violence, but also this economic violence. And it has to figure into our analysis and how we resist imperialism here. And I just wanted to put that out there. And and there's also, one of the questions that I had for the panelists was that, I think there's a lot of people who also think that it's important to continue to center sort of a racialized lens to what's happening in these countries as well, and how, the impact on indigenous and African communities in places like Honduras and Venezuela, and how, not only is it we see this dichotomy of the ruling class and the poor, but we also see sort of a racialized dichotomy as well, and and how important is that for our analysis and our conversation. And so let's start maybe with Max then.
Okay, well, I'll respond to as many questions as I can remember and try to keep it quick. There was a lot there, and I think a lot of people said things in a more powerful way than I ever could about the situation in Latin America. I've had to deal with these self-identified leftists who spend all of their time talking about what third world governments should do and how they should be replaced. And, I don't know the point of that unless you're auditioning for a State Department job in a government after Trump, because that would be the logical place to make those sort of demands instead of within like the ISO or Jacobin magazine or whatever. But, that's what they do. They want to be like Orwell and like criticize the left all the time. They're like Orwell without the literary talent. And what I always say to them, it's just like there's no point in doing it. Like, you're an American, you're in the heart of the empire. The only thing you can do on Venezuela is to demand that your government stop these sanctions. And it's important to remember that when Nicolas Maduro's government offered humanitarian aid to the United States after Hurricane Harvey in 2017, the Trump administration had already sanctioned his government 3 times. And of course, they refused the aid. Then we did a great job responding to Hurricane Harvey, didn't we? Like, how's Houston doing? So it's important to really make people understand that sanctions is a form of warfare. And right now in Caracas, a box of diapers costs $30. Like, if you want to get Huggies or foreign produced diapers, it's like $30 because of the sanctions. There's so much that isn't being reported in the US because of the sanctions. And I really appreciate it. I don't know if Sarah Flounders is still there. Her raising awareness about the national march we're doing in Washington. I think it's on March 16th. Am I right? Yes. That will be a really strong barometer of where we are on how willing people are to get out in the streets and demand that the U.S. end this economic attack on Venezuela. So it's important to be there, be in Washington if you can, vote with your feet. And to the question about what we can do to challenge imperialism in the U.S., I just did a video before I left here for Venezuela from inside the U.S. Capitol, where I challenged lawmakers and asked them, is the U.S. meddling in Venezuela? And then I challenged them on sanctions. I found Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez in the hallway and asked her, "Are you going to issue a statement on Venezuela?" And she said, "Yeah, we're working on one." And, you know, of course, she hasn't released one. I don't know, she was in a photo shoot for Elle magazine recently, so I guess she has better things to do. And she also didn't defend Ilhan Omar. But my point is, you can go into the Capitol and challenge elected representatives on this. You can go to hearings, as Ariel Gold did, for Elliott Abrams' grilling before the House Foreign Affairs Committee today, and make your voices heard. And you can do that in New York as well. You can, and there isn't enough pressure on them on Latin America. Finally, just because I heard a question about, you know, at-risk youth and anti-imperialism, and it's just a point I wanted to make, just about consciousness, which is that Trump constantly invokes MS-13 as this boogeyman to scare up white votes, scare up white working class voters. And we never hear about how MS-13 is the product of the dirty wars that we've fought in Central America and specifically in El Salvador. And we never draw the connection between the caravan and the coup in Honduras and just the constant US attack on attempts by Hondureños to actually develop their own sustainable economy. And we just need to start making those connections and explaining those connections to our friends and neighbors. And if the US decides, under the watch of Elliott Abrams, to fund another dirty war in Venezuela and arm the moderate rebels, as it did in Syria, we will not only see hundreds of thousands dead, we'll see a refugee crisis beyond proportion. And we'll see caravans that will make the last caravan just look like nothing. So we need to explain to people how this happens and how these countries have been destabilized because of politics and not some kind of endemic poverty. And that's pretty much where I'll leave it. Looking forward to coming back to the US and meeting you all and doing as much organizing as I can with you. Thanks
Thank you,
for
Max.
everything you do.
Thank you. Okay. Just putting a little more about what Marx was saying about this criminalization of street gangs. I'm going to invite you to read a book that I wrote with David Brotherton, John Jay, Gangs as Social Movement, which is a Marxist approach of the so-called epidemic gangs in the US. So it's the first time that we analyze the groups, not from a criminal justice perspective, but as a social movement. And the case that we follow very strong is the Latin Kings in New York City. That was a little information there. I think, my friends, brothers and sisters, whatever we're gonna do, we need to understand that capitalism is not in crisis. It's the crisis. So whatever we're planning to do, for good or for bad, need to be some kind of anti-capitalist approach. Second, I don't want you to get out of here without hope. There is hope, okay? Don't get depressed. Don't start jumping all over the places and throwing the towel. The dialectical praxis always tell me that oppression always produces the resistance. That is there. It's there, it's always been there. And I have a principle that I learned a long time ago in activism. I always like to share that a bad action is better than nothing. Okay? Doesn't matter you think it's bad, just do it. It's better than just sitting there doing nothing. So it's a very interesting principle in activism. Second, it's not in the Bible, but I'm talking to God to see if we can put it in the Bible. So I like what Facundo Cabral always say. Hay gente que jodiendo se joden. There are people that fucking around, they get fucked. Okay? So that is hope for me. Because this country with the government go places and then they go into asking why they hate us. Why they hate you. Okay? Advertising people, if you travel to this country or the other, do not let people see the USA passport. People get pissed off when they see the USA passport. We've been doing so many kind of nasty things against people all over the places that people associate us as part of the enemy. So the more I listen to people, the more I understand we need to go back to Paulo Freire 101, pedagogy of the press, raising consciousness, okay? And I really like the Jehovah's Witness approach. You throw them from one door, they come to you to the other door. They do not give up. So why, if I have a message, why is that I do not dare to do exactly what they're doing? Going out, knocking door, because I want to talk to you about a change, a revolution, something that is very important. Trump, in his last speech to the nation, he quoted the word socialism for the first time. Okay? They are scared. This is a very good signal. They're scared. Okay? So we need to take advantage of that. Let's break the silence. Okay? With whatever it is that you can do. How can Puerto Rico create some kind of economic independence? I'm not really sure if that is possible, but I'm a strong believer in the independence of Puerto Rico. I'm a socialist from the beginning to the end. So I think we can build a healthy relationship with the U.S. if they want it. They don't want it, get out of my way. Okay? It's not that we're rejecting. It's that we're saying, let's sit down at the table in a fair relationship. Okay? We can be part of CARICOM. We can develop our own economy. Never commit the mistake that some people did, not looking at what happened in Grenada, not too far away from Puerto Rico, 250,000 people, when the U.S. has been telling for more than 100 years to us, Puerto Rican, 4 million, that we are not going to make it because we are too small. How the hell that small island on the bishop leadership develop their own economy? That is possible. And we can do it also with other alliances in the Caribbean. Go back to Eugenio María de Hostos, Ramón Emeterio Betance, la Federación Antillana. It's possible. We can share, but we need to learn how to build healthy relationships. So, I close with this. There is hope. Don't give up. We're going to get there. Thank you.
It's always hard to follow him. I'm going to combine a couple of the questions about the role of what folks here can do. First, from I think what you call like Monday morning quarterbacking, right? I think what that services for me is that there really are folks on the left that believe the U.S. discourse on some level, right? We believe the rhetoric of human rights crises and concerns about democracy, and so it's a moderated approach, right? We want light intervention. We don't want full-on military intervention, but yes, something should be done, right? Some kind of sanctions, some kind of interventionist dialogue, and that is our left. That is the U.S. exceptionalism that permeates our left, which is really present now with Trump, because we think we're the only country that's ever dealt with fascism, because it's our fascist moment and it's all new, and so it's the only crisis in the world. And at that point, you began to hear, we don't have, and organizations, we can't focus on international work, everything's domestic front, all hands on deck, as though these were disconnected realities, as though we couldn't learn from other sisters and brothers abroad who've been dealing with fascism, financed, supported, funded by the US for decades. And the lack of an anti-imperialist approach and analysis in our work here precisely allows for these exceptions of the US. that say, well, I mean, we teach at John Jay. All of my students are immigrants or children of immigrants. Most of them want to work for law enforcement, right? There's this idea that yes, there's exceptions. The U.S. does good work, right? We intervene only when we're concerned about democracy or human rights. And we have to call that shit out. Like, that cannot be allowed at all. So when we're having these conversations with folks who are reflecting on what to do about Venezuela, you have one position: no intervention. That's it. No sanction, which is economic intervention, right? No intervention, period. The same way that there's this outrage at the idea that Russia interfered in our elections, right? We have interfered in elections around the world. I mean, that is official government policy, is to interfere in elections. We're doing that right now. Rubio from the Senate floor promising the military in Venezuela that they will release humanitarian aid, i.e. we will fund you if you rebel against your elected president, right? So we have to really, and it's hard, I know, because we are bombarded with that message all the time, even on the left. And it's really immigrant communities with connections to policies that have either driven forced migration or that we continue to see the impact of U.S. imperialism abroad that are trying to your point, to try to think of ways, well, what is our role here living in empire? And I think what's useful for me is not only having an anti-racist, anti-oppressive framework, anti-capitalist framework, because imperialism is built on capitalism, sustained by capitalism, and promotes capitalism, but anti-imperialism in all of our work. That includes domestically, right? So to me, the anti-imperialist framework means when we're talking about, development in East Harlem, we're talking about settler colonialism. We're talking about massive displays, not just gentrification, it's displacement of communities the same way that U.S. empire has done. And using that framework to think about, well, what does it mean when we have displaced communities and a restructuring of society, a restructuring of wealth, the hoarding of wealth, the lack of distribution or redistribution of wealth, who benefits from that, who's coming in and taking land and resources, talent, whatever. That is an anti-imperialist framework that allows us to think about our own organizing here and who are we after? Capital, right? Power. What is the source of that power? Who are we challenging with that? And recognizing that there isn't any distinction between when we talk about what's happening abroad in our name and calling that out and saying we refuse to be complicit by what our government does in our name with our money. Right? We reject that exclusively, and how they're funding that here as well to displace and target our communities. And that the policies that we talk about, war on terror and border security, are the exact same policies here. It just means that the government, our government, is creating the legal justification to not just, intervene, but to spy on the same people here, to issue surveillance. I'm sure if you go into many black communities, they'll say, yeah, we are under occupation, right? There's not a lot of difference here between, parts of Puerto Rico or Palestine. The other thing that I would say about what we can do is every single struggle needs to center Puerto Rico as part of its struggle, and Palestine, right? We cannot talk about imperialism and colonialism and not talk about the U.S. as colony. It can't be Puerto Rico or Puerto Ricans, right? It is what your government does on your behalf with your funding in your name. Puerto Rico has to be everyone's issue, right? The same as Palestine. We have to talk about that. Everyone. Yeah.
I just want to add a few words, honestly. I mean, Natasha almost said everything, so just about the question that you were posing. So of how to mobilize here. I mean, for me, that's a pressing question, particularly as we were discussing for those of us that are not only coming from the South, but from very specific stories. As I said before, those of us that survived that previous onslaught of U.S. imperialism, what is our responsibility? But more broadly, I believe that what I would like to ask is, what is the role of like immigrant communities and Latin American immigrant communities? Not to kind of like narrow the question, but just to point out that, you know, like land immigration is a sort of like very specific story, right? Like versus the people that immigrate, you know, like come from abroad, from different like socioeconomic status and fly. I believe that there's a specific role that sort of like Latin American communities in the US should play in this fight against imperialism. And I believe that the role of the youth is essential. Perhaps this might sound obvious, but a serious issue that I see with many sort of like immigrant communities here, but particularly young immigrants, is buying off in this narrative of the good immigrant and the bad immigrant, right? Like that the young ones, the DACA ones, etc., are the deserving ones, that they are US citizens, they are incorporated, they speak English, right? Like, and somehow that kind of like, I don't know, makes them belonging or gives them a claim of, you know, like being here that others don't. And I believe that you can reproduce that sort of like, or even in the most progressive, I mean, in some progressive circles, people were saying, let them all in, right? Like as if that was the horizon of a struggle. And then the question, I guess, for those of us that are in, are like, well, the in is not that great either, as we were saying, you know, like, because the wall is everywhere, and these forms of labor exploitation are people are coming in to be exploited too. But also people are gonna keep coming, right? Like, and it's necessary to address this sort of like source of why, you know, people are leaving their homes. So I guess that in the case of, you know, like youth, immigrant youth, I believe that there's like a huge political role that immigrant youth should play in the stabilizing the distinction good immigrant, bad immigrant, and also the distinction between the inside and the outside, and really sort of like framing immigrant struggle here and now, and the immigrant struggle of the youth, you know, like bringing it back to like the struggles of Latin America, sort of like against imperialism, just politically and also in terms of a strategy, which is what I was addressing before, that I believe that we really need to start thinking who to target and how, right? Like not only elected officials, as Max was saying, that it certainly is very important, but what are the other forces that we should sort of like start sort of like pointing out to, right? Like, and going after. So how to do that, I guess that we have to keep discussing it, but if you are interested in the coalition work that we have been doing around the caravan, there are like some immigrant youth organizations that have been involved, and I was like very happy to see that they were very receptive to getting involved in caravan support work. So if you are involved with any youth organizations and you want to join the coalition work and see how we can collaborate, let's talk. So, yeah.
I just want to thank the folks at the People's Forum for allowing us to use this space, and everybody for coming out. Did you want to announce something? Okay. Sure.
So beyond the 23rd, on March 3rd, we're going to be having an event at Father Barrios. There, he's for peace, dialogue, and no intervention in Venezuela. And thank you, Father Barrios, for accepting that. It's being called by rank and file groups, political parties in Latin America, and different organizations locally in your state. So if you're interested, you have to flyer to that before March 3rd at La Iglesia Santa Cruz.
Thank you.
Lucy, just pass it around, yeah.
You know, since she just made an announcement, I'm going to make another announcement. Because, you know, we talked about centering immigrants and workers and seeing imperialism and immigration, you know, through labor. And one of the organizations that I work with through the Food Chain Workers Alliance, my day job, is the Laundry Workers Center. I think many of you might be familiar with them. Well, they've been supporting a group of workers from laundromats throughout New York, who have been organizing for rights in the workplace, and they have a very important action happening this Saturday, actually in Brooklyn, and I have some flyers up here for you to take. And if you want more information, let me know. Thank you.
And I should say that the laundry workers are one of the organizations that have been very receptive about, like
Yes.
helping as much as they can with caravan support work or anything else. Even if they are sort of like already battling with capacity, they still take this seriously.
So thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Feel the spirit. Nena, felicidades.